welcome to today's episode of The Square. We are on episode 3 of our 4-ish episode series on water, and I'm joined in studio with Samantha Flores. Thanks so much for being here, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
And Varun, Kohli, the director of Echo.
Thanks for having me.
And, of course, Aaron Tartakovsky, our resident water expert and the CEO and co-founder of Epic Clean Tech. Thanks so much for being here, Aaron.
Of course.
Aaron did not know what he was getting into when we first asked him to help with this, because he was supposed to be with us for 1 episode, and I think we're going to end up doing 3 with him. So I appreciate you letting us pick your brain. And today's episode really is about, we've looked at and talked about water on a level of the building and kind of almost on an individual microscopic level. Today we're talking about water and conservation and challenges on a regional, kind of more urban level. And so I wanted to start the episode in a little bit of a unique way. I had a few locations as we were doing research that kind of surprised me about how water was affecting the region. So in Jakarta, Indonesia, in Bangkok, and in Shanghai, they're all sinking at almost an inch per year due to groundwater extraction and the combined weight of the city. Venice is only sinking a millimeter or 2 a year, but it's exacerbated by the sea levels rising and the compression of the soil that the city's built on. A little bit closer to home, Mexico City, which was built on a lake bed, and there it's both sinking and they're pumping the groundwater out. Some of the places in Mexico City are sinking at 16 inches a year. That is incredible. And then even closer to home, New Orleans is having, it's sinking at a rate of up to 5 millimeters per year in some parts because of the way the Mississippi River Delta and the weight of the city are. So I'm curious, the thing that is maybe a little depressing about some of this, Aaron, is we're talking about things that can't be reversed. You can't boost back up a city. What are some of the implications of this? Let's just start with groundwater, overpumping the groundwater.
Yeah, look, I think what you're getting into is the reality that a lot of the most severe impacts of climate change can't necessarily be reversed. In many cases, the train has left the station. And so a lot of it now is about adaptation. It's about mitigation. It's about adaptation. How do we go about living in a world where a lot of these types of sort of apocalyptic style events are starting to happen? In San Francisco, we're investing huge amounts of money to just build our seawall up, because the bottom line is you can't just, as you noted, pick up a city and move it. So it's about living in this new reality, which is not to say we don't try and reverse the effects of climate change and we don't try to mitigate it, but there are just too many things happening now. This is not some far off, it may happen one day event. It's happening now in real time. It's happening in all of the events that you outlined, and it's happening in a lot of places where it's not making the news, where we're not seeing it. But look, you just look at the amount of what we call climate refugees now, people who are moving because they just don't have a choice. This is the world we're living in. So I'm glad to start us on a cheery note here.
Well, and to continue that cheery note, Varun, you're there in New York, and 1 to 2 millimeters in areas doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of 25 years, that really starts to add up. And it's particularly in New York City, it really has to do with the weight of the materials that are being used in buildings. Again, not something you can really reverse at this point. How does that affect how you're thinking through design?
Well, let me just back up for a little bit. And you mentioned Jakarta. The one key thing, I don't know if you mentioned, I didn't hear that, but Jakarta is actually abandoning that city, right? Indonesia is moving its capital, building a new capital, because Jakarta can no longer support the population or the capital as a city. So we are mitigating in drastic measures now across the world. Coming home to New York, yes, the city is sinking. it's minor in some aspects, but the bigger challenge we're facing is not just that the city is sinking, but also the sea level is rising, right? And if New York City has actually put in place a New York City panel on climate change, and they have advisories out there about what we anticipate the sea level rise to be, and you'd be surprised by 2050. The criteria for designing these, coastal protection systems is assuming or anticipating the sea level rise to be 30 inches. 30 inches in 2050. That's only 20 plus years from now, right?
Wow.
It's a drastic change. And you take that 30 inches of sea level rise and combine it with, storm surges or, waves that come in during a storm surge. I mean, that's the amount of water that can come into the existing terrain is just unbelievable. So yeah, I mean, there's changes that have already happened. There's hard to turn back. It is time to adapt. But as Aaron said, we cannot abandon the mitigation part of things. We still need to save water. We still need to replenish the groundwater where we can. And at the same time, build protection systems and adapt and become resilient.
Varun, something that's interesting is I feel like every time I visit New York City, there's a taller building and a taller building and a taller building. And when we're talking about the weight of the city being part of what's dragging it down, literally, I wonder if there will start to be some restrictions on how high we can go.
Yeah, I wish. I don't know if there is a limit on how high we would go. I mean, I think, look, again, the weight of the city, I think, is still very minuscule as compared to what's happening in terms of the sea level rise. That's a bigger challenge. New York City is already working on, major coastal resiliency projects in the tune of billions of dollars to protect itself. So all of that is already happening. I don't know. I honestly, Sam, from a different perspective, I wish we would slow down on the new construction and start to deal with the existing building stock just from embodied carbon and energy perspective. But yeah, I mean, there is so much work to be done from all aspects.
We talked a little bit about some of the challenges and possible solutions last time on a building level. How is this something that you think about, Aaron, maybe on an urban level or a more regional level? We talked a little bit about the groundwater being pumped out. Obviously, there's some things that you can do to, have water demands lessen a little bit in terms of conservation. But what are some other, ways to address that challenge?
Big question, because there's a lot of different ways you can answer it. And look, I think just people come to the topic of water with a lot of sort of varying levels of understanding about how this stuff works. And so when we talk about groundwater withdrawals, I think just to maybe help some of your listeners understand what that means is that a lot of our water very literally exists underground. It's in underground aquifers and other forms of underground storage. And the way I like to explain it to people, it's almost like a bank account where we want to use that water. We are withdrawing it from our sort of collective water bank. But as we know with our bank accounts, they only work if we then deposit money back in, we deposit water back in. And if you want to sort of sum up our water woes in a very simple analogy, we are withdrawing water much more faster than we are replenishing it. So just wanted to sort of set the stage as to kind of what we talk about when we mean withdrawing water. And this is a common theme that I think is going to weave its way through all of our conversations, but there's just a fundamental misunderstanding of water. We think of water as this unlimited resource, where as much, and what I'm saying now is very much sort of a first world privilege kind of thing to say, but we think of water challenges and sort of overpumping of water and wastewater pollution as largely sort of this is relegated to the third world. This is not something that affects us, because for as much as people hear all of these headlines, all of these sort of these scary news alerts, at the end of the day, we read about it, we go home, we turn on our tap, water comes out. So until that mindset changes, a lot of people just aren't going to sort of start thinking about these solutions seriously. And I say all this, and this is sort of a very roundabout way of answering your question, which is to say so much of what we need to solve is policy related. We need to fundamentally change the policies of how we treat water, how we replenish water, and that starts at the top with our elected officials from sort of the federal on down. But as we know, politicians won't do anything unless people are asking for it, are clamoring for it. And so it's this just really complex thing of people need to know, they need to be educated about these issues, and they need to then petition elected officials, they need to petition their regulatory agencies, their government bodies to start making some of these changes. So it's going to have to go both ways. I think that's sort of my broad high level answer. In terms of sort of getting into some of the specific solutions, happy to do that as well.
I think that's interesting because, you mentioned that sometimes we think about water scarcity or our availability of water or too much water all being part of some ecosystem that's so far away, we're so far removed from. And, when we're talking about policy being the change, that definitely is something that needs to happen here. But across the world, there are still countries that are suffering water scarcity and water crises that have a direct effect on us.
Yeah.
I mean, the water scarcity crisis in Africa can cause mass migration across different countries, and that may overpopulate our cities and withdraw more water from our cities. It can also, if they're not able to wash their hands on a regular basis and then they mass migrate, can cause diseases that we are all too familiar with in this day and age about how fast disease can travel from one country to another. And I'm not calling out one continent or country or anything like that. That can happen from anywhere.
Right.
And so I do think, yes, it's important for us to focus on, policy here in the U.S., but then how do we translate that policy and any type of progress that we're making to help other countries as well? A lot of the different types of charities and things that operate out of the U.S. that work for different countries and help stabilize their infrastructure, that's something else that they will have to pass down. But we can't always just rely on charities to do that work because they are directly affecting us whether we see it or not.
We can talk a little bit about water conservation and water awareness on an individual level, but we're an equally as important impact is thinking about water usage on an urban level. And you were telling me about some of the ways that regions use water that you just kind of have to scratch your head and go, what were people thinking? And in particular with the Panama Canal.
Yeah, I just recently was listening to an episode about the Panama Canal. It was really focused on retail shopping, to be honest. I wanted to know where my stuff is. But what they were saying as a part of this podcast was that the Panama Canal, the way that it operates is when a ship comes in, it comes at a lower level.
Right.
And it needs to be raised up to the next level for it to go out of the canal.
Right.
And in order to do that, they take water from freshwater basins and lakes that are nearby. And that just struck me as so odd. Why are we using fresh water to then pour into seawater and ocean water to then flow out to ocean water?
Yeah.
We should be reusing that ocean water some way, shape, or form. Or, maybe Aaron has a thought around this, but reusing gray water or some other form of water that's not our freshwater supply, because our freshwater supply is dwindling in so many places, not just here in the U.S., it's dwindling across the world. And then the U.S., in a lot of cases, is taking from other countries.
Right.
So I think we should find some solutions there. And there are other things across the world where we are using freshwater supply for maybe ways that we could find, other solutions for. We talked last time about potentially finding different ways to use gray water systems for data centers to cool their systems. Right now we're using a lot of fresh water for that. Are there ways that we can challenge large companies and different corporations to really think about their water footprint on a regular basis and think about how they're impacting different water basins and freshwater supply? Because those companies often have multiple buildings and they supply different things to multiple cities, and they have a real impact on how our cities operate.
Varun, I'm curious. I know one of the again another idea of how water usage could potentially be changed is building materials. And I know that there's been some advances both in technology, but just an understanding of how to use water, particularly in concrete and other places. What are you seeing that could be a change in the materials that we use to construct buildings?
Well, before the materials, I was actually thinking about along the lines of what Sam was saying on, using fresh water to refill the canals, basically letting the fresh water run off into the ocean, which is what we're doing in a lot of our cities, right? Like we have known this. We've known that what we're doing right now by building a lot of hardscapes is we're just kind of pushing the water off, putting it back into the rivers or the oceans without storing them, without replenishing our own aquifers. So there's a lot that is easy to do. It has to do with the proper thinking around urban design and public realm design, making sure that we're using more pervious surfaces, making sure that we have some sort of water management strategy, whether it's retaining water in the building space or the urban space, and then allowing it to percolate down slowly. Right now in New York City as well, like all the stormwater just goes straight into our combined sewer system and out into the Hudson River, right? Like there's very little that's being, well, I shouldn't say very little, but there's more opportunity to retain some of that water, replenish our groundwater, and retain and keep it. I mean, one of the things we have talked about before is it's no longer just a dry spell. It's kind of both. Sometimes we get a lot of rainwater and then we don't have any water. So trying to balance those things is definitely something we got to be talking about. I know I didn't answer your question about materials, but
No.
The applicability of those materials, I think, is equally important in the public realm.
I think you raise a really good point. Aaron, excuse the naivete, but what are some of the practical ways that you can replenish the groundwater after you've pumped it out?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different solutions for it, but I mean, one of them is very literally pumping water back into our groundwater supply. I mean, you can literally pipe water back underground. If it sounds oversimplistic what I'm saying, that's because that's what it is. I mean, that is one way to do it. Another way is, I think, kind of building off of Varun's point, is that we can actually replenish water by letting nature naturally filter it. I think rather than sending water onto concrete or other impervious surfaces, you can actually have these setups where you have just a lot of ground that is capturing stormwater, and the ground will do what the ground is designed to do. I mean, if you think of a Brita filter, if you take a cross section of a Brita filter, it's basically what the earth is designed to do. It's just different layers of sort of these filtration materials. In our case, in nature, it's rocks and it's sand and it's different densities of rocks and sand that are nature's natural filters. So those are some ways to be able to replenish those groundwater supplies. But I think kind of to get sort of to the central question, I recently drove down to Los Angeles, where my brother lives. I'm up in San Francisco. And when you drive down from Northern California to Southern California, you drive through the Central Valley, which is one of the central food growing regions, not just for this country, for many parts of the world. And when you drive down through the Central Valley, you see a lot of signs from farmers. And there are very few people on this earth who understand the importance of water better than farmers. And they have signs that say things like, pray for rain. And that always bugs me. Not that they're praying. I am a religious person as well. This is not a knock on religion, but it's because I live in a city like San Francisco where every single day I see self-driving cars. I mean, we are literally watching these cars and people are freaking out and taking their phones out, taking pictures of these driverless cars and expertly navigating our crazy streets. And I'm thinking, we have the technology to have driverless cars, and yet we still have to pray for rain. We have so much technological capability available to us today that can do things like make sure we can resupply our groundwater supplies. And yet we still have to just hope and pray that it rains, we have the technology available to us today to make us water secure, which is to say we can create a society where we don't have to rely on whether or not it rains because we can use technology to de-risk that. And I think, when it comes to sort of what cities can do and what we can do in the urban landscape, it's the combination of technological advancement as well as smart policy that can get to us to a point where we can exist independently of weather patterns.
I'm curious, talking about technological innovation and how that can help us. When you're talking about the self-driving cars, my first thought was how much water went into making each of those cars. And are we using fresh water for in the manufacturing process? My second question as you were talking was thinking about what technology are we using? Because when we talk about AI, AI uses a ton of water because of the data centers that we use water as a part of the cooling systems. And so I do think that there's a real understanding that needs to be had about where we're using our fresh water and how we're using it and how it's affecting large regions. Because when you're using a ChatGPT to build your grocery list, like some of us do, or to find outfits for Taylor Swift concert, you may not realize
really important thing.
The data center that is for lack of a better term, crunching that data, is sitting in California, is pulling from a freshwater basin, and is using, hundreds, if not thousands of water just to answer your query.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important, one, that we think on the building scale and think about how freshwater and gray water systems can supplement. But I think on the regional scale, when we talk about our data centers or other types of buildings, thinking about how they're replenishing their basins if they are taking from them, just as Aaron's explaining, because I just think we need to be more responsible in that effort when we're planning different buildings for different typologies.
So I'll kind of throw this out to the group. We've talked about some of these cities that have some pretty big challenges ahead of them. Are there cities that are doing it well? Are there cities that are kind of like can be an example to others in terms of reclaiming or potentially pumping groundwater back, keeping the water ecosystem healthy?
There are many cities that are doing really important things. I mean, city, country, but a place like Singapore, I think, is doing tremendous things when it comes to water, and they're sort of employing a whole range of technologies to make sure that they are increasingly water secure or water resilient, whatever sort of combination of words you want to use. There are places, and this is not a city, but take a country like Israel, which is basically just a few big cities. That nation recycles 90% of their wastewater. And most of that means they're collecting wastewater, treating it, and then reusing that highly treated wastewater to irrigate most of the country's farmland. And when I say 90%, that's relevant because the second best country in the world is Spain at around 30-something%. And then the United States is playing around in the single digits. So we have a lot of work to do. Other cities closer to you all, Austin, Texas, now requires that all buildings over 250,000 square feet have to have on-site water recycling. Places like Los Angeles, any buildings over a certain size have to use 100% recycled water for their cooling towers. And I think the cooling towers, similar to the points you're making, Samantha, on data centers, cooling towers use an incredible amount of water. Mm-hmm. Now, again, these are not things that the average person thinks about, but just to cool our buildings, to cool our data centers, we use a tremendous amount of water. Why we need to use pristine drinking water from our national parks for those purposes is frankly beyond me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So those are just a few cities that are doing really great things. And even Las Vegas, where I was last weekend, Las Vegas has actually invested in a tremendous centralized recycled water capacity where every single drop that leaves a building, they are trying to recycle and sort of to create a closed loop city. So there's a lot of places that are doing really great things. The challenge is that so much of our infrastructure was put in 30 to 100 years ago. These are sunk costs, and it's hard to sort of dig your way out of that because we need to spend $1 trillion. Yeah, exactly. No, but look, we need to spend $1 trillion over the next 25 years to overhaul all of our water wastewater infrastructure. And it's hard to just say, you know what, we spent $7 billion putting in all these pipes and we're just going to do something completely different now. So it's finding that balance, which is a challenge, but it's also the opportunity,
Okay, well, I'm curious, because obviously the U.S. is significantly greater size than, a state like Israel, and so, or a country like Israel. Is it practical to think that we could get to something like 90%? And if not, what is the number you think is, legitimate to shoot for?
I often hear people in the water industry say, oh, look, Israel is the size of New Jersey. That's never going to be practical here. But I'm also someone who believes in anything is possible. I mean, why not? You're not going to have a national plan here in the United States, because anything that comes from the federal government as a mandate probably won't be accepted by a large swath of this country, as we know. But in terms of regional, I mean, why the hell not? I think my dream is, take a state like California, which may not be a country, but it has the 5th largest economy in the world. Why can't we have a situation where Northern California and Southern California have their own locally sourced regional water supplies? I mean, I think we talked about it in our previous conversation, but we are literally pumping water from Northern California up against gravity over mountains down to Southern California. Not only is that a tremendous amount of water, but it's a huge amount of energy, literally, to just pump water against gravity. So I think there are challenges and nuances to trying to compare us to Israel. But if you look at it at a regional level, there's no reason why we can't be 50% over in terms of recycling our wastewater in this country.
When I wonder if it even has to be a country statistic that hits 90. I mean, I do think that there will be states that would prefer to move faster on this.
Yeah.
And could we solve this at the state level? I am no policymaker, but if California is so interested, could they hit 90% and set some standards for some of our other states that are also interested but don't know how to lead the way? I mean, if we're comparing Israel to New Jersey, then that to me says that New Jersey can do it, size-wise. And to Aaron's point about pumping the water, I was just looking at some of the plans for the desalination process for Phoenix and seeing where they're planning on putting the piping to pump the water from Mexico and desalinate it for Phoenix. And, there are other inherent issues with relying on water basins that are so far away and pumping that water, not just the energy and the infrastructure, but the biodiversity. I mean, they're having to put that pipeline through national parks, and it's going to change the biodiversity in those spaces. And it's also going to change the way that we view this national park. I mean, because these pipes aren't insignificant.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to understand that not only are these problems, but the problems that come with desalination, those will stay in Mexico, and the U.S. gets the desalinated water. So we're not doing any benefit to our partnering countries or our neighboring countries. And I think that there's just a larger responsibility that we have when we're trying to take water from region to region that we're maybe not taking responsibility for right now.
I kind of question the whole premise of this, right? Like, historically, forever, our cities were built where they made sense, along the water corridors, around the rivers, in front of the oceans, where trading could happen and you had access to natural resources. So when you try to build, cities like Dubai and, expand Phoenix where resources do not exist, why do we force that, right? One of the things, I don't know if I mentioned in this episode, but I had read somewhere there's this notion of this Buddhist philosophy that you don't fight nature, you dance with nature. And that's how we should think about designing and building, right? Like, why are we forcing certain things to happen rather than going along with what's available? That's one. The second point I wanted to make was, like, places like Israel, and I, as Aaron was talking about that, I remembered I've done a number of new development projects in India and realized a lot of these kind of efforts are driven by necessity And in a lot of these Indian projects, we were building, major developments within a city, and you knew that the infrastructure just wasn't there to provide you with the water, with the electricity, or even with the sewage treatment system. And we would design and build for all of those things internally. So water collection, reuse, sewage treatment systems that would recycle the wastewater for irrigation or whatever. Everything was kind of done there just because you couldn't rely on the municipal system. So you'll see a lot of innovation come out of where the necessity is kind of driving some of these things. And then the third point I just wanted to make, and you guys mentioned this, is really understanding the relationship between all these natural resources, including water and energy, is so important. Like that example Aaron took, mentioned the water being flown, driven from one part of California to another. Same thing, cooling towers. We've been looking at, data centers where you put cooling towers and sometimes chillers on top of the roof, and they become super inefficient because they're exposed to direct solar radiation. And the moment we provide a cover canopy and then slap on some solar PVs, now not only are you generating a small amount of energy, but by covering and preventing, solar radiation from hitting these systems, the efficiency of those systems go up. So hence less use of water and less use of energy. So I think one of the ways we can really help is start to think of things in system-wide rather than in isolation, and especially at the regional scale or the city scale. That's how we're going to solve a lot of the problems.
I think it's a really good point, Varun, and I since you brought up the topic of desalination, there's some places that do it really, really well. I think Israel's one of them, Australia's one of them, and then there's some places that it has just not been as efficient. You've not gotten the same return on the resources. Aaron, can you talk a little bit about what the delta is between those two situations?
Yeah, I think desalination is interesting because it's something we hear a lot about. I think just because the concept, even for people who aren't in the water industry, makes a lot of sense. You take salt water, even in your home kitchen, you take salt water, you boil it, the salt stays behind, the water evaporates, that water that evaporates is now clean. So I think for some reason, people just really seize on desalination just because it makes sense. So yeah, you're right. Desalination was invented in Israel, and you see a company out of Israel, IDE, which actually does a lot of the big desal plants around the world, including in Carlsbad, California. In fact, recently I was speaking with a delegation of members of Congress who were going out to Israel, and they said, what should we see out there? Should we go see the desal plant in Israel? I said, you could, but you can save yourself a flight and go see the one in your district in Carlsbad, California, because it's basically the exact same design. Now, what's different about that Carlsbad plant is that it took about 15 years to build, significantly over budget, significantly over timeline. And it's because it's really hard to build anything big in this country, and especially in a place like California, where we have to get a lot of public input. And that oftentimes can slow projects down. So in the time that it took us to build one desal plant on the coast of California, Israel built 5 on their coast. And so, I think there's a lot of great things about regulation and sort of public input in the whole process we have here. But if we don't treat water security like the national security imperative that it is, then we're going to continue to sort of not be able to keep up with our water challenges and not be able to deal with them at the rate at which we need to. And so, there's a lot of common problems or common sort of complaints that come up about desal, and we can talk about them, but I kind of see desal just like I see any other technology, where it's going to continue to get better and better. It's going to continue to get more energy efficient. We're going to deal with all of sort of the negative byproducts that come with desal, but I think we do need to see a lot more desal. Is it a silver bullet solution? No, but very, very important solution. And I think San Diego is actually a testament to San Diego is now in a much better water position because they've invested so heavily into that desal capability in Carlsbad.
To your point about about desal not being a silver bullet. Are there other technologies that maybe people don't know about that can have, anywhere near the same impact?
So look, I think some of the key solutions that we talk about are things like desal. It's more efficient water treatment, water and wastewater treatment. So taking the existing solutions that we have today and just making them better. I think smart water is another really important piece. And what do I mean by smart water? Is the water and wastewater industry is very antiquated. We talk a lot of in the industry about the silver tsunami, which is to say there is an aging workforce in the water wastewater industry, and there's a workforce of folks who are not necessarily as savvy with technology, which means we still design and build treatment plants the exact same way. Well, now we have companies out there that using AI, they can design an entire wastewater treatment plant, including all of sort of the complex biological modeling that goes into a wastewater treatment plant. They can design an entire plant in hours in the same sort of, whereas it used to take weeks for an entire team of engineers and designers to do that. So I think it's a combination of desal, it's a combination of new technologies, it's a combination of smart water, as well as what companies like us do, which is decentralization, which is to move away from just building these giant plants and to instead build smaller distributed. I mean, I think we can learn a lot from the energy industry where we have rooftop solar, we have wind, we have hydro, and we've moved away from just building giant coal plants or nuclear plants. We can do the same thing for water. We're just 15 years behind the energy folks. So I think those are some of the key solutions that I think are going to be the change.
Do you think that you mentioned earlier about policy being the way to push us forward with all of these technologies? How close do you think we're getting to either national policy around water reservation or water conservation, or more localized policy that's statewide?
A concrete example would be drip irrigation. So not many people know the story of drip irrigation, but basically there was a farmer who was walking down his fence line one day. And as he's walking down, he's noticed that one of the trees in this line of trees was a lot bigger than all the other trees. And so when he kind of went in and investigated, he realized that there was a water line that was running along the trees, and there was a little crack in the line right above where that big tree happened to be sitting. So what he realized was that slow drip from that little irrigation line accidentally on that tree actually resulted in that tree being a lot bigger than all the other trees. That farmer ended up developing what would become the drip irrigation that we see all around us in the world today. And drip irrigation is so important because we're talking a lot about cities, but about 70 to 80% of all the water on this sort of the potable water that we use on this planet goes to ag. And in many parts of the world, from Asia all the way to the United States, we still practice flood irrigation. Meaning we are literally just flooding fields with water. And by the way, most of that water evaporates. We're just losing it. It's extremely inefficient. So in a place like Arizona, they're now passing laws that are actually banning the use of flood irrigation and transitioning the entire ag industry towards drip irrigation. So that's a perfect example of using policy to shift an industry. And by the way, they save money when you use drip irrigation because you use a lot less water. And not only are you getting the water to exactly where it needs to go, but you can actually do what's called fertigation, where you actually inject fertilizer into that water. So not only are you feeding water, but you are feeding fertilizer directly to the roots where you want the water to go. So I think that's actually one of the best examples of how policy has effectively sort of shaped what the future of a state or a region can look like.
I know that when we've talked about desalination in the past, and we'll talk about it again in the next episode as one of the solutions, but there has been a lot of conversation about the byproduct. So the leftover slush and slurry that comes out of the desalination plant. But you were telling me about some interesting ideas about how to actually be able to reuse that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's all sorts of things that you can do with the brine. And again, when we say brine, desal, you are literally using membranes to filter out all of the minerals, all of the salts from that wastewater. And you can do all sorts of things with that. One example is, for example, you can co-locate a desal plant to a power plant, for example. And so that power plant's going to be generating a ton of water from their own processes for cooling, for example. And so the challenge with the desal is, what do you do with all this highly concentrated brine? Well, if you co-locate it next to that power plant, all that water coming from the power plant, you can then combine the salt from the desal plant with the water from the power plant. You then have a diluted wastewater stream that can then be safely discharged into the ocean. And the challenge with brine is that if you just put a bunch of salt into one area of the ocean, it's going to be super, super saline, and animals and marine life will die. So, I mean, that's one example. The other one is that farmers can actually adapt their crops to subsist on brackish or salt water. And so we have examples where farmers basically raised new types of melons that can actually exist on this brackish desal water. And what it ended up producing was these smaller fruits, these smaller cantaloupe that ended up being smaller in size because of sort of the salt water, but then they ended up being sweeter. So there's there's amazing things we can do to sort of cope with these new types of technologies, which is why whenever someone will sort of flag any given technology as, it was meant to do something good, but it created a bad byproduct, well, then let's figure out what to do with that bad byproduct and then turn it into another positive. And I think that's what innovation looks like, is we're constantly going to be figuring out how to sort of tailor these solutions to ultimately be a win.
So I want to start with Varun, but then Aaron, you and Sam can jump in. I think one of the big differences when we talk about regions versus individual buildings or even individuals is there's two very different methods in terms of education and in call to action. With people it's one way, but when you're talking about cities and governments and bureaucracy, it kind of is a different way to see change happen. Varun, how have you seen change be successful in some of the various projects you've worked on, as well as even there in New York?
Well, one of the projects that I was involved with prior to joining Corgan was the Battery Park City Coastal Resiliency Project. And that's where I realized how much coordination is required for any urban scale or public realm scale project to happen. It is the benefits are also that much. So, for example, if we're doing a coastal resiliency project where we're trying to solve a problem for an entire neighborhood, what you're doing is you're taking away that responsibility from individual building owners. But at the same time, now you have to bring together all the community, the entire building owners, at the same time, technically trying to figure out how to do things where you've got Department of Transportation's streets running through, you've got DEP's sewer lines and water lines and electric lines from the local utility companies. So, it's a lot of sort of coordination involved. And this is what it kind of goes back to, everything that Aaron and you guys have been talking about in terms of different systems, is how do we start to think about these things in systems ways, right? Like it's not one thing in isolation, and this notion of like, okay, let's try and solve the problem on a building scale or an individual scale can be sort of incomplete, right? Rather than, thinking about it in whole building terms. And I always correlate the water issue with the energy issue, because we've gotten to a point where we're saying, as Aaron was saying, we've got it kind of distributed systems now. Every building has their own, smart systems, solar panels, whatever they're doing on their own to conserve energy. But, when it comes to peak load times during the summer months in the afternoons, everybody's trying to pull the same energy back in, right? So what New York City is now trying to do in that, on the energy side, I'm diverting a little bit, but what they're trying to do now is to say, okay, how do we become more smart about, collectively lowering our energy use during the peak periods. And that really helps save energy. It helps cut down on the coal plants that are fired up during those times, reduces carbon emissions. So if you think about water the same way, if each of these buildings are now starting to conserve water or save water or retain water during the storms, how can we build a network of these buildings to say, is there a collective way of saying, okay, we're getting hit by a 3-inch storm in the next 2 days or whatever it is, and how do the buildings come together to save and retain that water as much as we can, and then slowly release it back? So it's the systems thinking and going beyond, Aaron, what you were saying about the coal plant and the brine coming out of the desal plant. I mean, this is why we need to kind of go beyond one building and one system and start to think holistically of how we can solve bigger problems at the urban scale.
Well, and to that point, what Varun was saying about us maybe collecting water, I'm thinking, several townhomes that are, side by side, if they're all collecting the same rainwater from their roof system that's possibly attached, is it possible that we can then, allocate that water to each of the tenants? And how are we sub-metering that water? And are we sub-metering that water? In a lot of cases, I don't think that we have good sub-metering systems. Mm-hmm. And so even in our building that we're sitting in today, we have multiple tenants in our building. Do we know exactly how much water Corgan is using versus the other tenants in the building?
Yeah.
And that actually can drive human behavior, especially on the personal level where it's your home and you can actually have a lot of ownership and responsibility over your water usage. But as a company, if I'm in a multi-tenant building and I know exactly how much water my employees are using, then I might start to, and what incentives there are to reduce my water usage, then I might start incentivizing my employees in different ways and start building those habits. Yeah. And I think habit building, when we're talking on the individual level, is extremely important in reducing our how much water we waste, because that's where a lot of our wastewater is coming from. But that also doesn't relieve larger companies of the different responsibilities that they have on multiple levels. So I do think that this is a multifaceted problem that we should, really start to look into. And to Aaron's point, policy will help that.
Well, and so off of that, where have you seen policy work? Maybe some of what the pitfalls are where policy doesn't work and how to kind of avoid those, Aaron.
San Francisco is a great example. So San Francisco is in a state like California, which is just going from drought to drought to drought. And our elected officials came together and said, why are we still using fresh water from our national parks to flush the toilets of our tech employees in downtown San Francisco? So they ended up passing a law that requires that all new large buildings have to have on-site water recycling systems. So again, very well intentioned. In practice, it makes perfect sense. But then I think in going to Varun's point, it's sort of a systems approach, because we already had regulations in place in San Francisco that require stormwater capture. We are more and more trying to turn our cities into sponge cities so that when it rains, we don't have huge amounts of water flooding our sewer systems, which are then going to end up in the San Francisco Bay. Now, if you're a building owner and developer, you're kind of asking yourself, so now I'm required to recycle water on site and I'm required to capture stormwater, but there's some sort of overlap in these regulations. So how do we deal with some of the sort of inconsistencies that exist in those two types of regulations? Some of them are asking, well, if I'm already recycling 50% of my wastewater on site, and that's 50% less wastewater that I'm sending into the sewer, why should I also be required to have this stormwater management ordinance? So, we kind of see that a lot, and it's inevitable with any new type of regulation. You're going to have to figure out sort of what it bumps up against and how to sort of reconcile some of those differences. But I mean, that's one example that comes to mind of, we always need to be very mindful of, if we're solving for something, are we then sort of causing another downstream impact? And it's complicated, and it's hard to seize on every single eventuality that could happen. But that's part of what it takes to sort of implement some of these new policies.
Well, again, I feel like I've said this at the end of every episode in this series. There's so many things to consider and so many elements, but I appreciate Varun and Aaron and Samantha, you walking us through them. And thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check out the next episode.